Welcome to a Miss Marple mystery. Snow falls softly on Street Mary Mead, but not all that's buried lies beneath the snow. A Christmas choir gathers in joy until one voice ends in a scream. A candle burns, a shadow moves, and secrets meant for God find their way to sin. Someone in the village knows more than they should, and Miss Marple is watching. But before we begin, where are you listening from tonight? Tell us below. Snow had begun to fall on Street Mary Mead, turning its crooked lanes and red brick chimneys into a postcard of English serenity. Inside the church, the choir's voices rose in delicate harmony. Young and old gathered for the annual Christmas Eve rehearsal. The scent of holly and candle wax filled the air. Mrs. Weatherby, the vicar's wife, fluttered about with anxious energy, adjusting hymn sheets and tutting at the tenors for missing their cues. Beside her, Reverend Julian Copley tried to project good cheer, though the faint tremor in his hands betrayed unease. At the back pew, Miss Jane Marple sat quietly, her knitting needles flashing in the dim light. Few noticed her presence. To them she was simply the village's gentle old lady, harmless, observant, fond of gossip. Only those who had truly known her understood that she missed nothing. The final hymn ended. Laughter broke out, boots scuffed, and chatter filled the nave. Then came a sudden scream, sharp, high, unmistakably real. The sound froze every smile. At the foot of the chancel steps lay Mrs. Weatherby, her white gloves soaked in scarlet. The crimson spread rapidly over the pale stone floor. A dropped candle flickered near her side, sending unsteady shadows up the walls. For one suspended moment, no one moved. Then chaos erupted. The vicar stumbled forward, shouting her name. The choir boys shrank back, pale and terrified. Mrs. Bantry fainted gracefully against the pews. Miss Marple rose slowly, her eyes narrowing ever so slightly. "Do be careful with that candle," she murmured to no one in particular as the flame guttered near the blood. Within the hour, Inspector Craddock from Melchester arrived, sturdy, efficient, and already forming theories. "Accident with the candle," he declared at first, though his face betrayed doubt. But the doctor's arrival banished that hope. "Not an accident," Dr. Haydock said grimly. "A wound to the throat, precise and deliberate." The Christmas carols had ended in murder. By morning, gossip coursed through every cottage like wildfire. Some whispered of a jealous affair between Mrs. Weatherby and the organist, others of blackmail over the church accounts. Miss Hartnell, always dramatic, hinted at foreign spies. Miss Marple, meanwhile, sat quietly by her fire, a cat asleep on her lap. She had noticed something at the scene, something so small, so absurdly domestic, that no one else had given it a second glance. Yet in her gentle eyes, that trifle glimmered like a thread leading straight to the truth. The following morning dawned pale and brittle, frost webbing the window panes of every house in Street Mary Mead. News of the tragedy had rippled through the village like a dropped pebble in a still pond. By breakfast time, it had reached the bakery, the post office, and even Mrs. Price Ridley's relentless tongue. To some, the idea that kind, bustling Mrs. Weatherby could be murdered was unthinkable. To others, it was merely shocking confirmation that no village, however small or proper, was free from wickedness. At her neat little cottage on the edge of the green, Miss Marple poured herself a cup of tea and reflected quietly on the night before. She had not slept much. It was not the horror of the event that troubled her. She had seen death before, but rather the small, curious detail that refused to settle in her mind. Something about Mrs. Weatherby's position on the chancel steps. The way the candle had rolled but not fallen. Something was wrong with the picture. At 9:30, Inspector Craddock came to call. His face, ruddy from the cold, showed the strain of long hours. "Morning, Miss Marple." "I dare say you heard what happened." She nodded, her blue eyes mild. "Indeed, Inspector. Poor Mrs. Weatherby. Such a capable woman, though perhaps a trifle managing. Still, I cannot imagine who would wish her harm." Craddock took a seat reluctantly. knowing that the old lady's apparent simplicity concealed a mind sharper than most. "We've questioned everyone who was there," he said. No one saw a thing. The lights were dimmed for the hymn, and by the time anyone looked, she was already down. No weapon found. No sign of forced entry either. "We'll comb the church again." "Very proper," Miss Marple murmured. She sipped her tea, watching him thoughtfully. "I suppose you'll consider the choir members first? Human nature being what it is, tempers can flare among those who sing together. I recall the unfortunate incident at Street, Luke's, when the alto took offense to the soprano's solo and, well, let us just say it ended rather badly." Craddock smiled despite himself. "We'll look into every quarrel, though from what I gather, the vicar's wife was on good terms with most." "Most," Miss Marple repeated softly, knitting needles clicking once more. "But not all." That afternoon, the inspector conducted another round of questioning at the vicarage. The Reverend Copley, pale and shaken, insisted his wife had no enemies. The choir members were equally distraught, though their grief expressed itself in curious ways. Mr. Lionel Parsons, the organist, fidgeted under every question, his thin fingers twitching like spider legs. Mrs. Bantry recalled seeing him leave his seat during the final hymn, though he claimed he had only gone to adjust the music sheets. Then there was young Clara Linton, the vicar's niece, a quiet, mousy girl with tear-reddened eyes who avoided everyone's gaze and stammered whenever she spoke of the moment the lights flickered. Miss Marple attended the evening service out of habit, or so she said. In truth, she wished to observe. She watched the way Clara's hands trembled when lighting a candle, the way Parsons avoided looking toward the chancel. And she noticed, too, that the replacement candles were not from the usual church box, but from a mismatched collection, the sort one might find hastily gathered at home. Afterward, as parishioners murmured their condolences to the vicar, Miss Marple approached the steps where the tragedy had occurred. She bent slowly, inspecting the stone with polite disinterest. There, nearly invisible unless one knew to look, was a faint dark smudge near the brass rail, a streak of soot mixed with something else, something metallic. She straightened and smiled faintly. Outside, the bells tolled through the cold night air. The village would speak endlessly of grief, of sin, of justice. But Miss Marple knew that behind all such talk lay something far more ordinary and far more dangerous. Human nature, she thought, was like the snow, soft and beautiful from a distance, yet capable of concealing anything beneath its surface. The next morning, the frost had thickened into a brittle crust over the green, and the village of Street Mary Mead moved with a strange, muffled quiet. Curtains fluttered as neighbors peered out to see who might be calling on whom. The death of Mrs. Weatherby had become both tragedy and entertainment. Mrs. Price Ridley was already declaring it a crime of passion, while Colonel Melchett insisted it was some tramp, no doubt. But beneath all the speculation, there was unease, a creeping realization that someone among them had taken a life inside the sacred walls of their church. Miss Marple walked to the churchyard under the pretense of checking the flowers on her late nephew's grave, though her sharp eyes were really fixed on subtler things. The footprints in the snow, the faint scrape on the side door's latch, the curious way the snow seemed disturbed only on the path leading toward the vicarage. Each detail was neatly tucked away in her mind, unspoken but not forgotten. Inside the church, Inspector Craddock was speaking with the vicar. "We've confirmed the time of death between 8:15 and 8:20. No one saw anyone enter or leave, but the side door was unlocked." He sighed. "And still, no murder weapon. It's a clean incision, done with something sharp but narrow, perhaps a blade from a pocket knife or razor." The Reverend Copley sat in his study chair, his hands clasped tightly around a small Bible. "I cannot fathom it," he murmured. "To die upon the very steps of the Lord's house, surely it was not deliberate." Miss Marple's voice floated from behind them, soft but firm. "Forgive me, Reverend, but I rather think it was. People are curious creatures. When one is struck down in a place meant for peace, it is rarely accident, it is message. Craddock turned to her with a wry smile. "You've something on your mind, Miss Marple." "Oh, only that Mrs. Weatherby was a very particular woman," she said, "and people who are particular tend to notice things others wish they hadn't. Perhaps she saw something inconvenient." The inspector frowned thoughtfully. "You mean blackmail?" "Not necessarily, but a truth can be as dangerous as money, if it's the wrong truth at the wrong time." As she spoke, Clara Linton appeared in the doorway, her face pale, her hands twisting a lace handkerchief. "Inspector, you asked me to let you know if I remembered anything else." Her voice trembled. "When the lights flickered, I thought I saw Mrs. Weatherby speaking to someone near the vestry. I can't be sure who, a shadow, perhaps. But it wasn't Mr. Parsons. He was at the organ." Miss Marple regarded the girl kindly. "And what made you notice, my dear?" Clara hesitated. "Because—" Mrs. Weatherby looked frightened. The words hung in the cold air like smoke. Craddock scribbled in his notebook, murmuring thanks, but Miss Marple's gaze lingered on Clara. Fear often told its own story, who felt it, and who caused it. Later, as dusk began to gather, Miss Marple stopped by the vicarage kitchen, where the maid, Alice, was scrubbing the flagstones. "Terrible business, ma'am," Alice said, shaking her head. "And the poor vicar near beside himself. Mrs. Weatherby kept things running, knew all his papers, she did." "All his papers?" Miss Marple repeated gently. "Oh yes, ma'am, knew more than the Reverend, I dare say. She kept the choir accounts, the charity lists, even locked the donation box herself. Said she didn't trust the others with it. A woman of strong habits. Such people often come to grief, my dear, when they meet someone with stronger motives." That evening, as snow began to fall again, Miss Marple sat by her fire, replaying the scene in her mind, the light flicker, the unlocked door, the frightened glance. She leaned back, her knitting idle in her lap, and murmured to herself, "Fear, concealment, and a key that opens more than one door. Yes, I think I begin to see." The following day broke with a thin, colorless light. The snow now hardened into glassy crusts that cracked underfoot. The village seemed to hold its breath, as though the mere act of speaking too loudly might summon the murderer back to their midst. Even the bells of Street Mary Mead remained silent, their familiar peal replaced by the hush of dread. Miss Marple, bundled in her grey shawl, took her morning walk toward the high street, her expression serene but her mind whirring like a clockwork mechanism set to delicate precision. She stopped briefly at the grocer's, where Mrs. Price Ridley was holding court, her words flowing like gossip spun into scripture. "You mark my words, it's jealousy," she declared. The vicar was far too close to that woman. All this church work, late nights counting funds, anyone could see. Miss Marple smiled mildly. "Oh, I doubt that very much, dear. Reverend Copley strikes me as the sort of man who feels guilty merely for leaving his sermon unfinished. Still, people do the strangest things when they feel cornered." Her words, innocuous as they seemed, had the desired effect. Mrs. Price Ridley faltered, thrown off balance, and hurried to adjust her hat with nervous fingers. Miss Marple thanked the grocer, stepped back into the crisp air, and made her way toward the church once more. She had an idea that something there still waited to be seen. Inside, the air was cool and faintly scented with candle wax. The pews gleamed dully, and at the far end of the nave, Inspector Craddock stood with his men, the scrape of boots and murmur of voices echoing against the stone. He looked up as she approached. "Back again, Miss Marple? I dare say you know the place better than we do by now." "I find familiarity often reveals what the eye misses, Inspector," she said gently. "You've had no luck with the weapon, I take it?" "None at all. We searched every pew, the vestry, even the pulpit. Whatever it was, the killer took it with them or hid it well." Miss Marple glanced toward the steps where Mrs. Weatherby had fallen. A faint discoloration still marred the stone, despite the vicar's best attempts to scrub it clean. Her gaze moved higher, to the choir rail. And there she saw it again, the same dark smudge she had noticed before, slightly more distinct now. She moved closer, ignoring Craddock's puzzled glance, and peered at it. "Curious," she murmured. "This soot, and the faint metallic streak, almost as though something hot touched it. Yet the candles were ordinary wax, not oil." Craddock frowned. "You think it was caused during the murder? Perhaps. Or just before. You know, Inspector, people often tidy away the evidence themselves, without realizing its importance." He raised an eyebrow. "Meaning?" "Meaning," she said quietly, "that someone cleaned too soon, and not just the floor." Later that afternoon, she called upon the vicarage again. Clara Linton opened the door, her face pale and drawn. "I don't think the Reverend wishes to speak, Miss Marple," she whispered. "He's dreadfully shaken." "I quite understand, my dear. I only came to ask about the candles used that night. I noticed they were not of the usual kind." Clara hesitated. "Mrs. Weatherby sent me to fetch more from her own home. She said the church stock had run out." "Indeed?" Miss Marple's eyes softened, though a spark of interest lit within them. "And did she carry any herself?" "Yes," Clara said after a pause. "She had one in her handbag. She said it was special, something about beeswax purity for the service." Miss Marple nodded gently, her thoughts aligning like threads drawn through a needle. "Thank you, dear. You've been most helpful." As she walked home through the twilight, her cane crunching softly on the frozen ground, she allowed herself the faintest sigh. A special candle. Beeswax. A smudge of soot and metal on the brass rail. The picture was forming, but one piece was still missing the motive. And Miss Marple, with her deep understanding of human frailty, suspected that the answer lay not in anger or passion, but in something far quieter. Something whispered between hymns and hidden behind pious smiles. By the next morning, the weather had turned sullen and grey, the kind of damp cold that clung to the bones. The village seemed smaller now, its cheerful windows and tidy gardens overshadowed by whispers. Everyone spoke in lowered voices, glancing over shoulders as though murder might be catching. Miss Marple, however, remained her usual tranquil self. She sat near the fire with her knitting, her mind quietly busy with thoughts that wove themselves into a pattern as neat as her stitches. A knock came at her door just after 10. When she opened it, Inspector Craddock stood on the step, his hat dripping from the mist. "May I come in, Miss Marple? I could use a sensible mind." "Of course, Inspector," she said kindly, ushering him to the armchair nearest the fire. "I find tea helps clarity of thought. Do have some." He accepted gratefully. "I've had the lab look at that smudge you noticed on the rail. Trace of paraffin mixed with brass polish. And here's the odd part, tiny flecks of something that might be wax, but dyed red." Miss Marple's knitting paused mid-loop. "Red, you say? How unusual for a church candle." "That's what I thought. None of the regular ones match." "But the vicar's niece said Mrs. Weatherby brought her own candle that night. I thought perhaps it's a coincidence." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Coincidences are like weeds in gardens, Inspector. They spring up everywhere, but one should never let them grow unchecked." Craddock leaned forward. "You think that candle's important?" "I do. Not because of what it was, but what it represented. A woman like Mrs. Weatherby, careful, pious, and rather proud of her duties, would never introduce something unapproved unless she had a purpose. Tell me, did you happen to find her handbag?" He frowned. "We did. Oddly enough, the strap was torn clean through, and the contents scattered. Nothing much of note handkerchief, keys, a hymn book, and half a stick of sealing wax." "Sealing wax." Miss Marple's tone brightened. "Now that is most instructive. And the color of it?" "Red." "Of course," she murmured, as if to herself. "It always is when people seal things they wish to remain private." Craddock looked puzzled. "You think she was sealing a letter?" "Not quite. perhaps sealing something away. You see, Mrs. Weatherby was said to keep the church accounts, yes? What if she discovered a small irregularity? Something embarrassing, perhaps, but not criminal at least, not until she threatened to speak of it. The inspector rubbed his chin. You mean she might have been blackmailing someone? Miss Marple shook her head gently. Oh no, dear. Mrs. Weatherby was too self-righteous for blackmail, but she might easily have decided to set things right, as she would put it, and that sort of righteousness often leads to disaster. Later that afternoon, Craddock followed her suggestion to re-examine the vestry. It was a cramped space filled with the scent of polish and old hymnals. Near the ledger books, tucked behind a stack of offering envelopes, he found a small tin box locked. When he pried it open, there was a single envelope inside, sealed in red wax. The name on it, written in Mrs. Weatherby's firm hand, read, "For the Reverend Copley Private." When Craddock showed it to Miss Marple, her eyes softened. Yes, she said quietly. I thought as much. The question now, Inspector, is whether she ever delivered its contents or whether someone ensured she never would. Outside, the church bell began to toll again, slow and heavy in the mist. Miss Marple listened, her face unreadable. Evil, she murmured, rarely comes in the form we expect. Sometimes it hides behind kindness, or duty, or even a hymn. The envelope lay between them on Miss Marple's table, its red seal unbroken, glinting faintly in the lamplight. Inspector Craddock hesitated before speaking, his voice low. I'll have to open it, of course, but I can't help feeling as though we're trespassing on something private. Miss Marple's eyes, calm and sharp, met his. Murder has already trespassed on privacy, Inspector. Whatever is in that envelope will tell us not only what Mrs. Weatherby feared, but whom she trusted least. He nodded grimly and took out his penknife. The wax cracked softly as he lifted the seal. Inside was a single sheet of thick paper, covered in Mrs. Weatherby's tidy, slanted hand. Craddock read aloud, Reverend, I regret to inform you that discrepancies in the charity fund cannot be ignored any longer. I have verified the accounts twice, and the missing sum is substantial. I must insist we bring the matter to the church council before Christmas Eve. I cannot in good conscience let the matter rest. He finished and looked up, the weight of it heavy in the air. That's it. No names, no accusations. But a direction, Miss Marple said softly. You see, Inspector, it points not to who stole, but to who knew she had discovered it. That is the more dangerous knowledge. Craddock frowned. The vicar would be the most likely to panic if she meant to expose the accounts publicly. Miss Marple shook her head slightly. The Reverend is gentle, and far too meek to act violently. He would rather suffer scandal than sin. Her knitting lay idle in her lap as her thoughts sharpened. But Mrs. Weatherby kept those records herself, didn't she? She alone could trace the entries, the handwriting, the signatures. True, the choir treasurer, Lionel Parsons, helped occasionally, mostly with receipts for performances. Miss Marple looked thoughtful. Ah, yes, Mr. Parsons, a nervous man with clever hands and a fondness for precision. Organists must be precise, of course, but they are also prone to vanity. And vanity, Inspector, is easily wounded when pride is threatened. His cottage sat on the lane behind the church, a modest dwelling cluttered with sheet music and the faint smell of turpentine. He answered the door with red-rimmed eyes and fingers that trembled faintly. Inspector, Miss Marple, such a terrible time, isn't it? I can hardly play without seeing her there. She always turned the pages for me. Miss Marple offered a sympathetic, smile. You must have been quite close, Mr. Parsons. She seemed to think very highly of you. He swallowed hard, his eyes darting toward the piano. Yes, she did. She was kind, in her way. Demanding, but kind. Craddock's tone was casual. And she trusted you enough to share the accounts? The question struck like a dropped stone in still water. Parsons' fingers tightened on the doorknob. Only sometimes. I helped with sums, that's all. She kept the books. Miss Marple's gaze wandered over the room. On the mantel lay a half-burnt candle, red wax, its edge streaked with soot. She noticed it without comment, though the faint tightening at the corner of her mouth betrayed interest. "Tell me," she said gently, "did you happen to be in the vestry after the rehearsal that evening?" I might have been," Parsons stammered, "just to fetch my gloves." "Why?" "Oh, nothing at all," Miss Marple said lightly. "Only that the vestry is such a curious place to leave things undone." They left him soon after, and as the door closed, Craddock muttered, "He's hiding something. You saw his hands?" "I did," Miss Marple said, "and I also saw the candle on the mantel. Red wax again. It seems our Mr. Parsons has more than one form of devotion." Snow began to fall once more as they stepped back into the lane, the flakes thick and silent. Miss Marple paused beneath the lamplight, her breath misting in the cold. "Inspector," she said softly, "I believe Mrs. Weatherby's death was not born of greed, but of humiliation, and that is a motive as sharp as any blade." The next day dawned bleak and windless, the sky hanging low with the promise of more snow. Inspector Craddock was in no better spirits than the weather. He sat in the vicar's study, staring at the open ledger on the desk before him, its neat columns of figures betraying nothing. Miss Marple sat opposite, hands folded demurely in her lap, but her eyes moved with quiet purpose over the pages. "You see, Inspector," she said, "Mrs. Weatherby had written out every shilling with scrupulous care. The irregularity must be in the receipts, not the sums." Craddock nodded. The choir performance fees were always handled by Parsons. Could be that he adjusted the records before turning them in. "Possibly," Miss Marple agreed, "though I wonder whether Mrs. Weatherby had already confronted him. She was not a woman to sit on unpleasant knowledge, and I imagine her manner of doing so was unfortunate." At that moment, Clara Linton entered timidly, carrying a tray of tea. The girl looked paler than ever, her eyes red-rimmed as though she had not slept. "You've been a great help to us, my dear. I hope you're not letting this business weigh too heavily." Clara shook her head, but her hands trembled as she poured. "It's just Mrs. Weatherby wasn't kind to everyone, Miss Marple. She made people feel small. Mr. Parsons, she humiliated him last week after rehearsal, said his accounts were untidy, that his mind was unfit for church business." He looked as though he might cry. "Indeed," Miss Marple murmured, "and humiliation, my dear, can fester like a wound." Craddock leaned forward. "Did anyone else see this quarrel?" "Yes, sir. Reverend Copley did. He tried to smooth things over, but Mrs. Weatherby sent him away, said she'd handle Lionel herself." After the girl left, Miss Marple's expression grew grave. "I do believe we are circling the truth, Inspector. The trouble is, I cannot yet see whether Mr. Parsons killed in anger or in panic. Both lead to the same place, don't they?" Craddock said grimly. "That depends entirely on what he thought he was hiding." That afternoon, Craddock decided to pay Parsons another visit, and Miss Marple accompanied him. The man opened the door, looking disheveled, his eyes darting nervously. "You again," he muttered. "I've told you all I know." "Just a few more questions," Craddock said. "We've found a letter from Mrs. Weatherby about the missing funds. She intended to take it to the church council." Parsons froze, then laughed a brittle, unnatural sound. "Then she must have been mistaken. The accounts are in order. Everyone knows I keep proper records." Miss Marple's voice was soft but steady. "Of course you do. That's why you took such care to burn the evidence, didn't you?" He turned sharply toward her, color draining from his face. "What do you mean?" "The red candle on your mantel, Mr. Parsons," she said gently. "You used sealing wax to disguise melted traces from the ledger's cover. I dare say the candle you gave Mrs. Weatherby was the same kind, and that it contained something unpleasant within it. When she lit it at the chancel, It left that faint metallic mark on the rail, where the weapon had been concealed. Parsons' lips trembled. You can't prove that." Craddock stepped forward, his tone firm. "We'll find the knife, Mr. Parsons. You might have hidden it in the church boiler or dropped it in the pond, but it will turn up. And when it does—" "Stop!" Parsons cried, his voice cracking. He clutched the edge of the piano, as though the room was spinning. "I didn't mean to kill her. She threatened to ruin me. She said I'd stolen from God himself. I only wanted to frighten her to make her keep silent. But she wouldn't." His shoulders sagged. "When she turned her back, I acted before I thought." Miss Marple sighed softly, her eyes filled with quiet pity. "People so rarely think when they ought, Mr. Parsons. That is the real tragedy." Outside, as Craddock led the broken man away through the drifting snow, the church bell tolled again, slow, mournful, final. Miss Marple watched from the gate, her breath misting in the cold air. Beneath her calm exterior, a single thought passed through her mind: that human nature, in its frailty and vanity, was as constant as the turning of the seasons. The confession, though halting and fragmented, did not sit easily with Inspector Craddock. There was something in Parsons' trembling words that rang incomplete, a discordant note that refused to resolve. As the constable led the shaken organist away through the snow, Craddock lingered beside Miss Marple at the gate, his brow furrowed. "You've done it again, Miss Marple," he said with a weary attempt at humor. "But tell me honestly, do you believe his story?" Miss Marple's eyes followed the dim figures vanishing into the mist. "In part, yes," she replied softly. "But only in part. Confession, Inspector, is often an act of self-preservation. It relieves the conscience without revealing the whole truth. Mr. Parsons may have struck the blow, but I doubt he planned it or understood what he was protecting." Craddock frowned. "What do you mean by that?" She began walking slowly toward the church, her cane sinking slightly into the slush. "Mrs. Weatherby discovered an irregularity. Yes, but I suspect she stumbled upon more than misused choir funds. Something deeper, something that threatened someone far more important than poor Mr. Parsons." Inside the church, the chill had settled like a presence. The candles were unlit, and the nave seemed larger in shadow. Craddock followed her as she moved toward the vestry, pausing at the small table where the donation box rested. "You mentioned before," he said, "that Mrs. Weatherby handled the offerings herself. I've checked, there's no evidence of theft there." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Because she was the evidence, Inspector. She kept everything locked away, all except the books. And what she kept most securely was not money but information." Craddock looked puzzled. "Information? Oh yes. The sort respectable people prefer, never to put on paper," Miss Marple said, running a gloved finger along the edge of the box. She was a woman who collected confidences under the guise of church work. Letters from widows seeking help, young girls in trouble, small loans to those who couldn't repay them. I dare say she meant well, but knowledge of human weakness can be quite dangerous in the wrong hands. Before Craddock could respond, the door opened quietly. Reverend Copley stepped in, his face drawn, his clerical collar slightly askew. "Inspector, Miss Marple," he said, his voice trembling. "I heard about Mr. Parsons. Dear heaven, I never thought." He broke off, pressing a shaking hand to his temple. Miss Marple turned to him gently. "You've had a terrible shock, Reverend. But perhaps you can help us with one small matter. Were you aware of Mrs. Weatherby's letter to you?" The vicar's eyes widened. "Letter? No. I.O. Good Lord." He sank into a chair, his composure crumbling. "She told me she'd found something troubling in the accounts, but I begged her to let me handle it privately. She refused. I thought she meant to embarrass me before the council. But I never imagined." His voice broke into a whisper. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on him, compassionate but firm. "Then the irregularities were yours, Reverend?" He gave a small, strangled nod. I borrowed from the fund. Only a little. Only to pay the repairs for the roof until the diocesan grant came through. I meant to replace it. But she called it theft. I swear, I never laid a hand on her. I know, Miss Marple said softly. You didn't need to. Someone else did it for you, someone who thought to protect you. The vicar's head lifted slowly, confusion mingled with dawning horror. Protect me? Who could? Miss Marple's eyes rested on the far doorway where Clara Linton stood, her hands clenched at her sides. The faint light from the window fell across her pale face, illuminating eyes full of fear and something fiercer. Because, Reverend, Miss Marple said quietly, devotion takes many forms, and not all of them are holy. Craddock turned sharply toward the girl, who had begun to tremble. You, what did you do? Clara's lips parted, her breath shallow. She was going to destroy him, she whispered. She said he'd brought shame upon the church. I only meant to stop her from speaking just to make her understand. But when she fell, there was blood, and I couldn't. Her voice trailed off, the confession hanging in the cold air like smoke. Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly, a shadow of sorrow passing across her features. Ah, she murmured. So it was love after all. Not greed, not pride, just the same old folly that has undone so many before. The silence that followed Clara's confession was so complete that even the ticking of the vicar's clock seemed hesitant, as though time itself dared not intrude. Craddock stood rooted to the spot, his pen poised over his notebook but unmoving, his expression torn between disbelief and pity. Clara's shoulders shook as she clasped her hands tightly before her, her voice breaking into small, shuddering breaths. I didn't mean to kill her, she whispered. I only wanted her to stop saying those things, to stop looking at him as if he were wicked. Miss Marple moved closer, her footsteps soft against the stone floor. There was no anger in her eyes, only a weary understanding born of long experience. You followed her to the church that night, she said gently. You knew she'd stayed behind after the rehearsal, didn't you? Clara nodded, a tear slipping down her cheek. She told me earlier that day she meant to confront him. I begged her not to, she said. The truth must come out. I couldn't bear it, Miss Marple. He's been like a father to me ever since I lost my parents. Everything good I've had came from his kindness. I couldn't let her ruin him. Craddock found his voice at last, steady but grave. And so you confronted her. Clara's eyes darted to him, wide and frightened. Yes. She was in the vestry, locking up the box. I told her she was wrong, that he hadn't stolen anything. She turned on me, so cold, so certain. She said I was young and foolish, that I didn't understand sin. I lost control. I grabbed her arm. She struggled and fell against the steps, and then she just stopped. Her words dissolved into sobs. It wasn't supposed to happen. I didn't even realize she was dead until I saw the blood. The vicar's face had gone white. Clara, my dear child, what have you done? He moved toward her, but Miss Marple raised a hand gently. Best not, Reverend, she said softly. Sometimes affection blinds us to what must be faced. Craddock's jaw tightened. We'll have to take her into custody, he said quietly, signaling to the constable waiting at the door. Clara did not resist. She stood trembling, her eyes fixed on the vicar. I only wanted to save you, she said through tears. You're all I have in this world. As she was led away, the Reverend sank heavily into his chair, his hands covering his face. The air in the room felt thick with sorrow, and the faint scent of extinguished candles. Miss Marple stood beside the window, looking out onto the white landscape beyond, where the snow fell in quiet, endless patterns. It is always the same, she murmured after a long pause. Evil begins with the smallest seed, fear, pride, love, and grows in silence until it bears its bitter fruit. Craddock sighed deeply. You were right from the start, Miss Marple. It wasn't about money after all. Just devotion twisted the wrong way. She turned to him with a sad smile. Human motives seldom come neatly labelled, Inspector. In Street, Mary Mead or London. The sins are much the same, only the curtains differ. Later that evening, the two walked together through the churchyard, where lanterns flickered faintly beside the snow-covered graves. The cold bit sharply at the air, but the village, for all its grief, seemed to breathe easier now that the truth was known. "What will happen to the vicar?" Craddock asked. "He'll go on," Miss Marple said softly. "Broken, perhaps, but he'll find comfort in service. As for Clara, she will have a long time to reflect, and perhaps to pray. Youth makes terrible mistakes, but it is also capable of redemption." Craddock looked at her, half admiring, half bewildered. "How do you always see it so clearly?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly beneath her hat. "Because, my dear Inspector, people never really change. The setting alters, the manners improve, but hearts remain quite the same. And I've lived long enough to know that beneath every hymn and every prayer there lies a story waiting to be told." The wind stirred softly through the churchyard trees as they turned back toward the lane. Above them, the bells of Street Mary Mead began to toll. Once more, no longer mournful, but gentle, forgiving, as though marking not an ending, but an absolution. The following morning brought a fragile calm over Street Mary Mead, the kind that follows a storm yet carries its memory in the air. The snow, though untouched and glistening, seemed less pure now, more like a quiet shroud than a festive veil. Inside her cottage, Miss Marple sat by the fire, the flames reflecting softly in her knitting needles as she listened to the distant chime of the church bell. There was a sadness in the sound, but also peace, as though the village itself was sighing with weary acceptance. Inspector Craddock arrived just after noon, his boots caked with melting snow. He looked tired but relieved. "Clara's made a full statement," he said, removing his hat. "The Crown will be merciful, I think. Given the circumstances, the court may call it manslaughter. She'll be sent away for a time." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Youth rarely escapes the consequences of passion, Inspector. But perhaps in time she'll understand that love, when it seeks to possess or protect at all costs, ceases to be love at all." Craddock sighed and sank into the armchair opposite her. "The Reverend's taken it badly. Keeps saying it was his fault, that if he hadn't taken the funds, none of this would have happened. He's resigned from the parish." "That may be for the best," Miss Marple said softly. "A community forgives a good man, but it never forgets his scandal. He'll find work elsewhere, quiet, honest work, and perhaps that will be his penance." For a moment, neither spoke. The fire crackled, and the clock ticked its measured rhythm. Outside, a few children were laughing faintly in the snow, their joy distant but comforting. Then Craddock leaned forward, elbows on his knees, studying the old lady with a curious smile. "You know, I've been in the force 15 years, Miss Marple, and I still don't understand how you do it. You never ask for evidence, never demand confessions, you simply see." Miss Marple chuckled softly, the sound as gentle as the rustle of wool. "My dear Inspector, it's not so mysterious as all that. People reveal themselves endlessly. In the smallest of ways, how they hold a teacup, how they speak of their neighbors, how they tell a lie that doesn't quite fit the shape of the truth. One only needs to have lived long enough to recognize the patterns." He smiled faintly. "Patterns of wickedness?" "Patterns of weakness," she corrected. "For wickedness is often no more than weakness ungoverned." Mrs. Weatherby was self-righteous, the Reverend too trusting, Mr. Parsons vain, and poor Clara, well, her fault was simply love misplaced. The pattern was there from the beginning. It only needed time and circumstance to unravel. Craddock stood, pulling on his gloves. "And you, what will you do now that the village is calm again?" "Oh, I expect there will be some committee meeting or other," Miss Marple said lightly, "and Mrs. Price Ridley will want to reorganize the Christmas bazaar in light of recent events. People need something cheerful to occupy them. You know, grief grows tiresome when it lingers too long." He laughed quietly. "You're a remarkable woman, Miss Marple. She tilted her head, eyes twinkling. "Nonsense, Inspector. I simply pay attention. One must. In a place like Street Mary Mead, it's the only entertainment we have." When he left, she remained by the fire a while longer, gazing into the glowing embers. The world outside was still and white, and though the church stood once again in peace, she knew its silence would hold echoes of that dreadful night for many winters to come. Yet life, in its obstinate way, would go on. The choir would sing again. Laughter would return to the lanes, and new secrets would slowly bloom beneath the calm surface of village life. Miss Marple lifted her teacup and smiled faintly to herself. Human nature, she thought, was endlessly tragic and endlessly fascinating. And in its quiet, intricate way, it would always keep her company,